So welcome. The topic today is quite catchily titled, I have to say, What a Nuisance Sect is Women Plant Collectors in the 19th Century. And we're delighted to welcome a speaker from far away. For the first time in quite a while, we're delighted to welcome someone from further afield, literally from Colorado. So thank you, Tina, for coming to join us to look at some of the things here and to give this talk in person here at McGill. Thank you to everyone who's here in the room. I'll do a little camera tour at the end for everyone on Zoom to see everyone in the room. But for now, we'll keep it stationary. Note about the place that we're meeting in today, and that is a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples here in the Montreal area. That includes the Haudenosaunee Nation and the Anishinaabe nations, amongst other Indigenous nations that have exchanged ideas and meeting and trade in this particular place, including the cultivation of plants and wildlife and fauna and flora that make this place what it is. We recognize, honor, and respect those peoples, and we're continuing that tradition of exchanging ideas today by welcoming someone from much further afield to tell us about others who actually did wander very far into the actual field, collecting plant specimens in the 19th century. So thank you for reflecting with me for a brief moment on the place that we're in. And it's a little far removed as we're on the 4th floor of a brutalist building, which is very, very dense concrete, which interferes with our Wi-Fi sometimes. So we do have a hardwired Ethernet connection. Don't worry, everyone on Zoom, we won't lose you. But it was an interesting weekend for all of us here in Montreal. And quick show of hands in the room, did anyone lose power? Oh, that's about 30%. Quick straw poll. Well, I'm glad you've joined us. There are definitely still people who are waiting for the power to come back on. So thank you for joining us, for making the effort to come in person. If you need to plug in your phones, there's an outlet at the back of the room. But on that note, I will stop this screen share actually, and I will invite my colleague Lauren Williams up to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So hello, I'll take this off just while I'm speaking. Hello, everyone. My sincere thanks to all of you for joining us today, whether in person or online. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Lauren Williams, and I'm the curator of the Blacker Wood Natural History Collection here in the Rare Books Department of McGill Library. The collection was established in 1920 through the efforts of Dr. Casey Wood, who was an ophthalmologist who toward the end of his medical career became fascinated with the study of bird vision. This interest led him to begin collecting works on ornithology, but his library soon grew to include material on all aspects of zoology. After it was donated to McGill, the collection continued to grow, and it now includes material covering all of the natural sciences from the medieval period up to the 20th century. So since taking on responsibility for this collection, I've often been very pleasantly surprised to find out how extensive it is. When rare book dealers send catalogs of items on offer, or when I attend book fairs, I'm delighted to find that we often already have a copy of whatever's on sale. However, one particular area has emerged as a bit of a gap in our natural history collections, and that area is botany. Casey Wood was much more fond of birds and vertebrate zoology in general, so unfortunately didn't spend much time seeking out works of botanical illustration, for instance. Perhaps because of the time period in which he was collecting, the 1920s, or a lack of books on sale, there are also not very many female naturalists represented in the collection. Rather ironically, I would estimate that today around 50 to 60% of the reference questions I get from patrons relate in some way to botany and to women in natural history. So over the last few years, I've made a concerted effort to build up the Blacker Wood collection in this area. One of the ways in which I've done this has been to focus on acquiring herbaria and commonplace books kept by women in the 19th century. The Victorian era saw a real explosion of interest in exploring and documenting the natural world, especially by non-scientists. Botany was one of the few subjects considered to be appropriate for women to engage with at the time, and so much of what remains from this period are notebooks, scrapbooks, and other handwritten compilations where women would paste in botanical specimens that they had found, complete with scientific or common names, and sometimes interspersed with excerpts of poetry or prose that they liked, and occasionally would also include messages to friends and family. These books weren't meant for posterity and were sometimes passed between members of the same family and added to by different women. So they provide a remarkable and intimate view into the lives of the women who created them. They also allow us a valuable window into the extent of the knowledge of botany held by the creators and the kinds of plants that grew in certain regions. I've put a few of these recently acquired works out on display in the exhibition case just to the left of the door when you leave this room, and also just right up here, a few examples for you to see. And I've also included a few highlights that were already held in the Blackerwood collection, like Maria Sibylla Marion's stunning 17th century work on general history of insects of Suriname and Europe. It's a work on entomology, but she also includes beautiful engravings of the plants on which the insects feed. And Elizabeth Willem's paintings of flowers, which she painted in South India in the early 19th century. So don't be sure not to miss those on your way out. I've been hoping for an opportunity to call attention to some of these botanical works by women, and so I was delighted to come across the research of Dr. Tina Gianchito, our speaker for today. I first discovered her work through her book on women, nature, and science called Good Observers of Nature, American Women and the Scientific Study of the Natural World, 1820 to 1885. She's an associate professor of environmental humanities at the Colorado School of Mines, and has also published articles on Darwinian botany, evolutionary science, and women's participation in botanical correspondence networks. Her current projects include a public plant story website called Herbaria 3.0, What is Your Plant Story? And a book that examines Darwin's plant studies and evolutionary theory in the late 19th century US. Her talk today is titled What a Nuisance Sex Is, Women Plant Collectors in the 19th Century. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Tina Gianchito.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the folks online for being here as well. That was a lovely introduction, Lauren. Thank you. And you actually speak to a dimension of women's experiences with plants that I'm hoping to talk about today, which is that when women, a lot of the women that we see or that I'll talk about today are seeing plants as an essential part of their community formation. And so you mentioned the kinds of books that you have out today. I'll mention similar types of books. These were really meant as social documents, right? And so what I'm going to be talking about today are primarily women engaged in correspondence networks, not only with professional scientists, but also with other women, other collectors of plants. And I'm happy, now I have to get my own piece up. I'm happy to be here in person. I actually jumped at the opportunity. I was invited to be an online speaker. And I said, I can come to Montreal if you would prefer. Because I also found it challenging to give talks on Zoom. So thank you all for coming and for welcoming me here. So my work for the better part of the past 20 years has followed women botanists off alone on their trails, as Alice Eastwood, a botanist that I'll talk about a little later, wrote to her friend Catherine Brandigee in the 1890s. She's also the author of this quote, "What a nuisance sex is," which I'll get to in a little bit. So today I'd like to talk about notable and yet virtually unknown 19th century women botanists. And these botanists collected primarily in the US West, but this is just a small sampling of the vast numbers of women who are involved in botanical collecting and other forms of botanical experiences in the 19th century. But these folks that I'll be talking to are collecting primarily in Colorado, California, Washington, and Oregon, as well as throughout the Southwest and into Mexico. So I'm often asked how I first started studying these women, many of whom, of course, have been lost in some ways or others to history. And the easy answer is also, I think, fairly common for anyone who spends time in research archives, such as these here. I just got a quick glimpse behind the scenes a few minutes ago. So while poking around the files looking for one thing, I found something else entirely different. And the archive in question was the historic letters collection at the library of the Gray Herbarium Archives at Harvard. And I was looking for letters to Asa Gray, one of North America's most well-known botanists, from the popular nature writer and naturalist Mary Treat. So from here, though, I was really intrigued. So I asked for letters, just generally, letters to Asa Gray. And within those, there were a whole series of folders from these women writers. And I was directed to the archive's semi-historic collection and who was in there. And this is where, looking through these files, I started to see, among countless letters by male botanists, a scattering of letters by women writers, including many from these remote areas in the US. And of course, my faded, dingy photocopies, files of messy photocopies have now been replaced by lovely scans, which are actually legible at the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which, if anyone is interested, particularly in botanical archival materials, that is an invaluable resource, particularly for people looking for correspondence, because they've done an amazing job of cataloging and making available these correspondence. So you can get all this, you can find all this online now. So the Great Correspondence is just one example of a much larger phenomenon, and the archival correspondence files of professional scientists around the world contain troves of letters written by women and provide a textured snapshot of the world of women's scientific engagement in the 19th century. And of course, some of these examples are here in this exhibition. But what I think is most extraordinary about the bulk of women's scientific correspondence is that in many ways it is not extraordinary at all. And so in the first place, scientific literacy, as many of you possibly know, was the cultural currency of the day. And when I'm talking, I will be talking mostly in the US context, but I think this is true across the North American context and in the UK and across Europe as well. So this scientific literacy connected people across communities, and participation in science activities such as flower collecting, weather recording, joining scientific societies, or even reading about scientific topics in magazines and newspapers was considered a form of profound civic engagement necessary for a rapidly transforming, increasing technological nation. Professional botanists around the country capitalized on the popular interest in science and relied on far-flung networks of these good observers who could be trusted to provide crucial specimens, observations, and contacts with other field collectors. So in fact, these networks, if any of you are familiar with the citizen science initiatives, these networks functioned in much the same way. And if members of the public, male or female, young or old, rich or poor, had something worthwhile to contribute, they were welcomed into the system. Gray's Herbarium at Harvard, for instance, became a clearinghouse for such correspondence. He was engaged for years and years, most of his lifetime, in fact, in a large-scale biogeographical project, the multi-volume Synoptical Flora of North America, an example of it right there. So collecting information about plant life covering such a huge geographical area required the participation of individuals in these remote outposts, all of whom collectively contributed thousands of examples of the nation's diverse plant life to the project. So as noted, botany held pride of place, particularly among women in the 19th century. And I do want to say, I've already mentioned that the similar arguments that I'm about to make today can be made for women in Canada and the UK, but I'll also pause here to note that I'm talking primarily about white women across the economic spectrum. There's a deeply problematic absence of Indigenous and non-white women's voices in the archives in all contexts, right, globally. And I can talk in the Q&A about a project that I'm currently involved in to help address these archival absences that's ongoing. So with that said, if we look at popular advice manuals, magazine articles, flower language books, and domestic fiction of the era, it appears that female invalidism was epidemic. So even Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, in his essay, Walking, where he is championing, whatever, he is promoting what he calls absolute freedom. Even he acknowledges in Walking, he says, how womankind who are confined to the house stand it, I do not know, but I have grounds to suspect that most of them do not stand it at all. So botany got girls outside. It was promoted from the early part of the 19th century. 1829 was the first botanical textbook written specifically for girls that came written by Elmira Hart Lincoln Phelps, who was an educational reformer with her sister Emma Willard at the Troy Seminary in Troy, New York. And they were both interested in getting girls out of this cycle of education that was just rote memorization. And so they both advocated for this kind of active, full body immersion into education. And botany got girls outside. It trained their minds and their bodies, and in doing so, enriched their domestic lives. So it's important to keep in mind, of course, that that even these educational reformers are thinking about the domestic space for women. So they're not necessarily advocating that women leave this domestic space, but rather that they be happier in their domestic activities. And so I particularly like the end of this quote: the objects of the science are scattered over the surface of the earth, along the banks of winding brooks, on the borders of precipices, on the sides of mountains, and in the depths of the forest. So we're not talking about garden study of plants here, right? We're talking about really getting out there and engaging with the natural world. And this textbook was enormously influential. It was in print until 1872 and sold over 275,000 copies from the time of its first publication in 1829. So generations of girls studied with this botanical textbook. But although my focus is on girls, you should also know, of course, that boys were studying botany as well. And what's been called botanizing was one of the most popular leisure time activities throughout the 19th century for both men and women. So there's this incredibly robust and profound network of collectors during this time. So thousands of women continued their botanizing long after their school days and sought ways to engage in conversations with others about their efforts. And I'd like to draw your attention to these two books right here. So this example of an herbarium and of the Malkin sisters books. And so, as noted, these women would often display, these would be displayed in parlors alongside natural history cabinets, and they would be meant as these kinds of social documents for people to look through. So of the women that we can find in the archives, we can sort of classify them into three different groups. A majority were true amateurs, and these were leisure time botanizers seeking to engage experts as a way to increase their knowledge of a science. And so these letter writers generally wrote only once or twice, and many followed the same format, which was a brief introduction, perhaps indicating the reason why they were writing, a list of plants that the writer had available for exchange, often a request for identification of an unknown plant, or a request for a hard to find publication. And usually finishing with a promise to locate and send any local plants that the botanist may be interested in. So on the flip side, botanists were often completely overwhelmed by the volume of correspondence that they received. And their ability actually, I mean, many of us are sympathetic. Many of us can't even manage to respond to emails, right? Never mind handwriting out all these letters. So this was really seen, this kind of responsibility for correspondence was felt on both sides. But there are also some incredible little advice, articles on advice from these overwhelmed botanists who would basically sort of beg amateur correspondents to follow certain rules of scientific etiquette when writing, right? And they would tell them, they would give them information about how to present materials, how to mail them, how to frame their queries so that the botanists could answer them in the most efficient ways possible. Other women established deeply personal connections with these same professionals, writing many letters over the courses of years, and talking about everything from family life to personal finances, and often talking about health and commiserating with botanists about if they had heard they had been ill, through the ways. There were a lot of these very sympathetic letters that were exchanged with people. So at the opposite end of the spectrum were those women engaged in scientific knowledge trade as a professional enterprise, and we have three here. These included naturalists sharing experimental observations, such as Mary Treat. Mary Treat was a correspondent of Charles Darwin. She was the only woman mentioned by name in any of Darwin's publications, and she was an expert on carnivorous plants, and Darwin actually asked her to do specific experiments on plants for him. She was introduced to Darwin through Asa Gray. Catherine Brandigy was the curator of the California Academy of Sciences, the herbarium there, and Alice Eastwood was her friend and the curator of that same herbarium after Brandigy retired. We also have a number of commercial collectors, particularly in the West, and these included Rebecca Merritt Austin, and you'll see a trend, right? Turned to collecting when her husband became ill and unable to work, began collecting when her husband's health failed, and Sarah Plummer Lemon, she collected in conjunction with her husband, who was an invalided Civil War veteran. So all of these women turned to collecting not as their primary work. Austin was a cook at a miner's camp. Her husband was a gold miner. Ames came to California with her husband to found orchards, right? So these women had to turn to botany as a way to make ends meet. So a majority of writers, though, came from women. This is what I was talking. So a lot of these letters as well from these professional collectors will tell the botanists about the problems that they're having. And so this one is, during the late financial depression, we lost the most of our property, and my son, on whom we depended, has recently died. So I am left at the age of 50 years with an invalid husband and a very small income. I have thought sometimes that I might get a situation to teach, et cetera. And so this is a person who's explaining the rationale, the reason why she has turned to professional collecting, and explaining this to the botanists at the Gray Herbarium. So the majority of letters, though, are from women who fell somewhere in between these two poles, neither novice nor professional, but women who were deeply invested about knowing their local landscapes. We were talking about knowing trees. A lot of these folks were transplants from eastern cities and felt that the landscapes were deeply hostile. And in fact, many of them were quite hostile to settlement. And so they were looking for ways, if not to replicate the landscapes that they had at home, which they often did by planting seeds, out in the frontier spaces, but also by just getting to know their landscapes around them. So these letter writers might include teachers requesting information for students, as the woman A.E. Bush, a teacher at a normal school in San Jose, California, wrote for plant identifications when she was in the process of reconstructing her school's herbarium. She wrote, which was all gone in a flash when fire destroyed her school building. So you also get a sense when you're reading these letters about the real contingencies of existence for these folks. Some letters told of daring adventures. I love the series of letters that this woman, Almeda Hodge Barrett of Oregon, wrote to Gray. Here she describes an expedition to Mount Hood, collecting at 3,000 feet above sea level and, quote, 500 feet above snow line. She ascended and descended steep slopes and, quote, high ridges in pursuit of her specimens. To reach one plant, she was, quote, obligated to climb a steep bank just where the snow had melted, leaving a yawning fissure a foot to 18 inches wide. Slipping, I only saved myself by springing over the chasm just as I saw I must go. So she was sorry to find, after all of this, that the specimen that she procured was, quote, nothing new. But Gray nevertheless rewarded her courage in collecting by naming a local Hood River plant after her. And this is the Penstemon Beriche, which she produced a botanical specimen, an herbarium specimen for. Another favorite exchange of mine involves high drama in a local scientific society, the Syracuse Botanical Society. This is made up of women who had been friends and colleagues for years, but they disbanded in a flurry of dismay and hurt feelings after one faction of the group found a rare plant and refused to tell the other faction of the group where that plant could be found. And so only half the group had this plant in their herbaria, in their collections. And so these folks were so agitated about this that they wrote to the botanists at the Gray Herbarium, trying to get them involved. And they also wrote to Charles Darwin to ask him to take sides one way or the other. And he politely declined. His letter in response is very funny. He's like, I'm sorry to hear about this. No, thank you. I'm not going to get involved. But I mean, these letters, this is like sort of the 19th century polite vitriol, right? They're basically tearing each other apart. But it just goes to show you just how important these activities were. So when we look at these letters sort of as a whole, we see that the active pursuit of scientific interests enabled women to address the loneliness and isolation that often marked their lives, the contingencies that marked their lives. It empowered them to expand their networks beyond the home, to bond with others over a shared love of the natural world, and to create networks that encouraged and sustained all parties through the years. For some, isolation came in the form of geography, as I mentioned, especially among those women writing from frontier spaces. So botanical study was not only a way to get to know their local landscape, but it was also a way to stave off the boredom of rural life, especially since many had been relocating from eastern cities. But for others, the intellectual isolation arose, even among those in cities, from having few around who shared their scientific interests. This understanding that women botanists were seeking a, quote, sympathetic audience for their ideas about science can help, I think, explain the other and more personal dimensions of letters in the correspondence networks. To write a letter, to post it, and to reply to letters received was to forge a bond across space and time, and to participate in a communal enterprise that transcended mere knowledge trade. Letter writers, though, and especially these botanical enthusiasts, sent not only words, but they sent things. And it's almost astonishing to think about the mass of matter, of formerly living matter that was sent through the mail. I mean, any visit to an herbarium where you'll see just the stacks of plants that are often sent through the mail. I'll never forget this moment at the archive of Auguste Forel, an entomologist in Lausanne, Switzerland, where he had started notebooks where he would record the ants that he had received from collectors in the mail. And when at the beginning of these notebooks, that each ant gets sort of a half a page. And then as the years go by, they start to get, a quarter of a page, and then a couple of lines, and then one line, and then a half of a line, right? So the writing gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And you just imagine all of these vials of ants that are getting sent to him from all over the world. So legislative changes in the postal system throughout the 19th century, including the shift to a uniform pricing system based on weight, made sending material artifacts economically viable for a wider public and transformed the postal system into a medium of mass participation. So enclosures and letters, these are an example of 2 herbarium sheets. Included these pressed flowers, insects and pollinators, seeds, specimen lists, books, copies of articles, etc. These were all considered vital elements of letter networks and enabled correspondence to compress the vast distances that often separated them. So enclosures of a more personal nature include and were especially signed photographs. And these photographs, this is not just in these botanical correspondence networks. Of course, this is well known to send these photographs. But they stood in for a correspondence physical presence, binding, quote, distant friends in sympathy, as postal reformers argued. And words, specimens, and photographs together combined to create an image of intimacy and friendship amidst scientific exchange. One of my favorite exchanges about this was between a collector and a horticulturist in Boston named George Davenport with Emily Pelton. And she sends him, she had trouble because she had moved to California from the East, and she had trouble getting a picture. And when she finally got one, she sent it to him with a letter. My photo, she said, you will find enclosed among the ferns, and could it speak, it would give you friendly greeting with a warm grasp of the hand. So there's this image that as he's pulling off these specimens stacked in this letter, that he encounters her image in the midst of these specimens. It's just a lovely image, I think. So many of these letters between collectors and enthusiasts and professionals illuminate these bonds of knowledge and sympathy, even as they mix these requests for identifications. We have these consolations about illness, fatigue, and overwork. So this is John Gill Lemon, the husband of Sarah Plummer Lemon. And Rebecca Merritt Austin writes to him, "We are in this together." She was writing him this when she was offering to help him secure specimens for sale. "Remember that I am always your friend and will endeavor to help you in all that I can. So whenever you may need any plants that you can think I can get for you, ask for them, but do not say any more to me about paying money for them." for this makes me feel that you think I am selfish and work only for money. Now, keep in mind, this is a woman whose own husband is ailing from mining, right? This sense of commercial collectors banding together can be seen across these women. So Mary Pulsifer Ames also sought to help Lemon, writing to George Wilson, a prominent Eastern horticulturalist. The wretched state of his health wholly unfits him, we think, right? So they're all talking. We think for any occupation except botanizing, which keeps him a great deal in the open air and provides a healthful and diverting recreation for his mind. He was one of the victims of our late Civil War, was almost literally starved to death in that disgraceful death pen of Andersonville. His diary, by the way, this is an image that comes from his diary. His diary was recently found by an archivist at the Jepson Herbaria, and she is now published on it. So that came out, I think, just in the last year. So in spite of these successes, I'd be remiss if I failed to talk about the real problems that scientific women faced when they went off alone on their tramps. And I think it's pretty astonishing to imagine from our position in the 21st century, the historical realities that these letters hint at. This is from Rebecca Merritt Austin. Again, she recounts a trip she took with a friend. Much credit is due to Mrs. J.C. Largent for her help in making this collection. She is a brave, noble woman. We traveled 300 miles in the Cascades alone, and she managed the team. And yet, despite the collecting successes that she had on this trip, Austin is circumspect. I enjoyed the trip, but I do not want to take it again unless my husband can go with me. It is not safe. There are too many wild animals and desperados. I always thought I was brave, but I was afraid on several occasions on this trip. And you can just imagine, you know, like sort of my definition of brave and her definition of brave are probably two very different things, right? So Alice Eastwood, one of the most prominent botanists of the late 19th century, was known throughout the botanical world as an ambitious and courageous collector as well. Eastwood often traveled alone or with male and female scientific companions into the remotest areas of the West. She regularly carried a pistol. She regularly wrote to her friends about being followed by people and, you know, feeling this sort of trusty pistol by her side. She modified her clothing for the field, devising an ingenious system of buttons to turn skirts into pants suitable for hiking and riding the vast distances she covered in her botanical expeditions. Nevertheless, she wrote to Brandegee for advice to face a particular quandary she encountered during the planning of a long-awaited expedition to Mineral King, California. I had planned all summer to go to Mineral King in September. I wrote to Visalia to inquire about the stage and have learned the stage no longer runs there. At Three Rivers, the only place to stay is at the house of an old widower with grown-up and small children. I stayed there in the spring. He made love to me, and though I snubbed him, he even wrote to me after I returned, asking if I might come and see him. I did not reply, but I can't go there again, and I'm afraid that I'll have to give it up. What a nuisance sex is. So the wild animals, the desperados, the people following her where she has to wear a gun, that doesn't bother her as much as this old widower who won't leave her alone, right? And so although Eastwood chalks up the episode to the nuisance of sex, she nevertheless registers the real restraints placed on her scientific pursuits that result only from that sex. So in her letter to Brandegee, Eastwood places this episode in the broader context of women's rights when she writes this letter by prefacing her story with other news. Their mutual friend, the British suffragist and education reformer Mary McRoberts, had left California at the demand of her husband, right? So she's clearly framing this as a political statement when she's thinking about the limits on her own abilities. Eastwood likely knew she was writing to a sympathetic audience. Brandegee was clearly attuned to gender concerns in her own position as the curator of the California Academy of Sciences. She once opened a letter to a fellow curator who had written to her from the Gray Herbarium saying, quote, "Your letter to the curator of the Herbarium of the California Academy of Sciences, dear sir, has much amused me. Having been its curator for 8 years, I am dear madam." So both gender considerations and classification concerns shaped Catherine Brandigee's career. She took a degree in medicine after her ex-husband, Hugh Curran, a notorious drunkard, died and saddled her with debts that she had to pay upon his death in 1874. Curran turned to medicine, but found it difficult to establish practice as a female doctor, and instead turned to botany to support herself. As noted, Curran, later Brandigee, was attuned to gender considerations in her letters with colleagues. And an especially interesting exchange, which I'll end with, comes from an 1884 series of exchanges between Curran and Gray. So apparently Gray had proposed naming a species after Curran. She thanked him somewhat half-heartedly in a, quote, nearly forgotten postscript. She says, "My own name is Lane, and I would prefer to have so called any plant which you may kindly call for me." Although Gray's original letter and reply were lost when the Academy collections were destroyed following the earthquake and fire that hit San Francisco in 1906, whose collections, by the way, were rescued by Alice Eastwood in sort of a daring series of escapades to get these plant specimens out of a burning building. That's another story. But we can reconstruct something of the conversation in Curran's subsequent letters to Gray. He must have asked her for clarification, as she replied, "I answer in this your previous letter as well as the last, and will try to explain myself in respect to names." So here's, oh, that's Curran right there in Baja. So she says, "In the first place, I do not greatly care for them." This is named species. "And if a genus is to be named for me, I would prefer that it be after my death. In the next place, your Burgianus plant is altogether too unsightly, and I hereby wish it distinctly understood that no plant which is of an ill smell, covered with prickles, or of which the fruit stands on its head, is to be christened after me. I should not like such an erroneous opinion of my appearance and habits to become current." It's great. And that's the Borgianus right there. "In regard to specific names, your argument that one must be either married or single hardly covers the grounds. Whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. And who knows, but I might tomorrow take it in my head to marry a man named Smith. What would you do with the species named for me? Smith, eh? Therefore, please evolve a generic name for your homely weed out of your inner consciousness, and if out of your kindly feeling you sometimes wish to name a species for me, then call it Lane." Such an excellent letter. So her reply is both acerbic and witty, but she deploys humor to make a serious point about power and powerlessness. Having already been divorced, she's clearly aware of both the contingencies of marriage, I might take it into my head, and in contrast of the lasting nature of scientific nomenclature. She also is clearly aware of the well-established deployment of botanical nomenclature as a tool of ridicule for scientific rivals, right? It is thus significant that Curran requests that if Gray insists on naming anything after, he would do so under her maiden name. At the same time, the subject of her humor, namely her feminine appearance, highlights her awareness that that appearance simultaneously marks the source of both her marriageability and her exclusion from the scientific arena, right? So it's this incredibly complex letter where she's playing on these gendered tropes. But Gray must have had both some sense of humor and awareness. he obliged, creating the genus Lane using Curran's maiden name. So as an aside, Curran did marry again later in life to Townsend Brandegee, who was himself a well-known collector. And the two of them sort of became this botanical collecting powerhouse. And they collected through the Southwest and into Mexico. So Catherine Brandegee and Alice Eastwood are exceptional in the world of 19th century scientific correspondence. Both occupied important positions that required voluminous correspondence with scientists across the country. As a result, their correspondence files have been more comprehensively preserved in the archives than is typical for women scientific practitioners of the period. And they offer the most comprehensive examples of the kind of botanical exchanges that women engaged in during the latter part of the century. The majority of women's scientific correspondence in that century does not fall into this category. Most of the richest botanical exchanges, where plants and flowers were sent not only to professional botanists, but to friends and family as tokens of remembrance and affection, are largely lost. And as the majority of women's scientific letters only exist in the archives of notable scientific men and institutions, and even here they are only, quote, accidental stowaways, as Susan Scott Parrish calls such items, preserved only by virtue of being within the collections of other people. The letters written by the women in the Gray Archive collection and other archives show that was what was not collected, as well as those things which were unintentionally preserved. The fact that we find a great many stowaways in the archives indicates that women participated fully in the scientific communities of the 19th century, engaging in different types of scientific correspondence and largely following the conventions of their male colleagues in establishing and maintaining scientific networks. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tina. We do have time for questions. I'll ask if you have questions in the room, if you can come up, because our microphone is up here. So you can just come up to the side of the podium and ask your questions from up here. On Zoom, you can put your questions in the chat and I'll voice them on your behalf. We'll start it off with a question from the room. Come on over.
Hi, I'm the room. That was fascinating and enjoyable. Very much. One thing I found particularly curious, and you may or may not have had a chance to find information on that, is what were the economics of people collecting specimens and sending them to?
Yeah.
This is a fascinating story I've been completely unaware of. So I'm wondering if you were able to find any information about how lucrative or not that would be.
Yes. Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So a lot of the letters will indicate how much certain specimens cost. And a lot of times the cost of those have to do with the difficulty of collection. But the other thing that people, and this is both men and women, right, that they talk about is the cost of mailing. And so when specimens are not accepted, or when there's any sort of question about specimens, the collectors can get sort of testy about how much they're spending to send example after example after example. And they'll talk about the cost of paper, the cost of the postage, the cost of the envelopes. And there's a clear sense that the collectors are trying to be both respectful, but also remind the professionals that they don't have the luxury of a salary, right? And they're not funded by anybody. So I can give you specific examples of that if you want later on. I can, share letters.
We have one from the Zoom actually asking about the genus of Lane, if I pronounced that correct, today. What family it belongs to today, because someone was looking for the record in Cecilia. This question comes in from Cecilia. So if you know.
Thank you, Cecilia. I do not. but I'm sure I could find out if you want to send me an email, that's fine. A lot of times these names are renamed, these botanical nomenclature changes. I would look, where I would go to is the World Plants at Kew. They have a really extensive, extensive information about the plant names and how they've changed over time. So.
Hi, I'm from the room as well. And it is kind of related to Chris's question. It's economics, that first textbook that you showed us, 7 editions right up until what I think 1872. So that, and you gave a figure in thousands, hundreds of thousands of copies. Well, does that mean that those sorts of publications were really accessible economically, like people were able to purchase them for pennies? Or
I don't know the cost, though. That information would probably be found in a book called The Botanizers by Elizabeth Keeney. But these were school textbooks, so these were largely largely these would have probably been kept within the school and given. I don't know if I'm going to date myself here, but where you used to get textbooks and you used to have to cover them in the brown paper from the grocery bags. I'm assuming these were in the same category, that they were held by the school and then they went through different editions. Great. So, yes, please.
So where's the mic?
Yeah, right there.
Okay, I'd like to thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I'm a member of 2 horticultural associations, and I study landscaping and design and everything. So the question I have is my concern. I brought this up in other ecological conferences, the mixing of the species. So we have the boreal forest and we have the Bornean. So they've been breeding species, trees, and this has been, we've been transferring amphids in the process. So we have a problem here with the emerald ash border.
Sure, of course, we have it in the same. Yeah.
So I think this should be prohibited. If there's a problem species, it should be prohibited from further plantation. We're having a tremendous problem here in Montreal. We've lost a lot of trees. So what is your perspective?
I'm not a botanist. I'm not a horticulturalist. I just want to be clear that I'm a historian of science, and so, but I think that there are important historical dimensions to your question, and one of them, it has to do with the importation of species across the globe, and a lot of that is taking place, starting from the 17th century and these global expeditions, right, that are displacing native species. And certainly this is occurring all over the place. It's occurring when botanists are taking plant materials that they receive, plants, and raising them, and then these displaced native species, indigenous, plants that are native to areas. But again, that is well beyond my purview as a historian of science to talk about that. So
They have to be kept below the equator.
there are lots of
Thank you for that comment. We might be
that,
able to continue that discussion a little bit later after the talk. We have a couple more questions in the room. We'll take another one from the room, and I'll just pass on thank yous and comments from the Zoom, including the recommendation of a publication about Canadian 19th century women botanists. So we'll share that one in the follow-up. Next in the room, we had a couple of hands. Anna, do you want to come up? And then you in the hat second. Sorry, I don't know your name. Anna, come on up.
Hi. Hi. Thanks so much for the talk. It was great to hear about all these women. You mentioned right at the beginning that you had a project which was looking at the contributions of non-white women to botanical studies. So I just wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about that.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a really exciting project. It's a 5-volume work on women in science in the British Empire, writ large. From, I think we're starting around 1640 to going up to about 1950. My volume is on plants, and we are, with my co-editor, Jeff Bill at the University of Delaware, we are looking for any information that we can find about women botanical knowledge producers within the British Empire. We're also, so white women are largely going to occupy a large space, but we're also looking for information that came from indigenous women, healers, and also from enslaved peoples, particularly in the, and also within the Indian context as well. So we're trying to look for those places where we can fill these gaps. I have to say, it is incredibly difficult to find those silences in the archives. And but there are some great people. If you're interested in thinking about these silences in archives, I recommend the work of Susan Scott Parrish for thinking about how we can reconstruct silence in the archives. So if anyone has any contributions that you want to make to that, please let me know. We're welcoming people.
And the last question, one up.
I just first want to say thank you for your presentation. I found it so strangely relatable to see how a lot of these things are still sort of reflected in my life. One thing that really struck me was your mention of how like isolation, rather geographical or social, sort of fueled these practices because people felt this need to reach out and to communicate. And one thing that comes to mind for me is my Oma, my grandma, she lives in Petersfield, Manitoba, which is a really small town. And so I like to keep in touch with her sometimes by sending emails. So for example, the other day I went on a hike and I had sent her a bunch of photos from with all the plants and stuff. And we're able to sort of keep in touch this way. So like email, virtual letters, sort of, but still maintaining this idea where, you write and you update the person on your life and your health and, how's school going, but then you also have all these like images in there, like of all the plants. So I'm just sort of wondering, how do you think that modern digital media, things like emails, photographs, Instagram and social media in there, how like modern media has sort of affected this practice? And do you see it continuing or it moving into something new?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a fantastic question.
Okay, great.
Oh, that's your earring. Oh, win-win. There you go. That's a fantastic question. And social media, Instagram, it is awash with plants. I mean, people are sharing plants all over the place on social media. And I think I'm working on another project right now, and I had a slide for it and I took it out. I took it out. That Herbaria 3 project, which the whole intention of that project is to get people to share their stories about plants with each other. We have, I don't know, 60, 100 stories on that, plus about 150 that I still have to curate, which I just haven't gotten up yet. But so I think that the digital space is going to offer huge opportunities for these kinds of conversations to continue. And I think the other thing that's really important about social media is that all this botanizing takes place in the 19th century, right? By the end of the 19th century, you're starting to see vast populations of plants being wiped out by collection. And you start to see articles in magazines of people warning about plant extinctions and what had been formerly robust communities. And so I think that social media, I see like these plants kind of carrying on, both being able to carry on their lives to the extent that they can, in their place, but people recording their interactions with those plants via social media. So yeah, I think that's a great example of it. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for questions. I'm going to briefly show everyone on Zoom, everyone in the room, the giveaway. Hello, hello, hello. And I'll invite Christopher Lyons up for some closing comments before we sign off.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I think this was a really wonderful example of absolutely what we've been trying to do here at ROAAR and at McGill, and that is to build these wonderful collections. And I'll just give a shout out to Lauren, because as you heard, she's responsible for the natural history collection amongst others. So she's had the task of unearthing and collecting and gathering and cultivating botanical material. And I love puns. Okay, I'll just get you in on that. So she's been unearthing them and watering them and bringing them to the light. And what's great is once we've done that is in having you here to bring them to life and to bring it to the life of the people who collect these and the dynamics of how they were collected and the people who often don't get much of the credit for this. So not only are we sharing the well-known stories, but we're sharing the hidden voices behind many, many of these stories. So thank you so much. That was so stimulating. And for those of you who have an environmental or natural history frame of mind, I want to tell you that the Mossman lecture coming up on April 24th at the, I think it's at 5:30 at Moot Court, is being given by Bob McDonald. So if you grew up in a CBC radio household like I did, you have been hearing this man's voice for Quirks and Quirks for about and the nature of Quirks and Quirks, right? Yeah, for about 30 years. And I still remember when David Suzuki did the show, because I think he was the first host. And I still think that Bob McDonald's a new kid, even though he's not, but he's a wonderful speaker. He's very kind. And we're going to have that. And just if that's not enough excitement for you, today at 5 o'clock, we're having a small vernissage for Japanese art exhibition that's put together by my colleague Octavian Sapierre and the people from the Visual Arts Collection. And at 5:30, the James McGill Society is featuring Tim Cook at the Faculty Club talking about medicine in the First World War, and particularly the contributions of McGill, which were spectacular at that time. So I want to retire and just hang out here all the time. Sadly, by hanging out here all the time now, I actually have to do things, but it's well worth it. And we have parting gifts for you. If you want to come, are we still on camera?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to just come up here and act excited.
I'm very excited.
We have a couple of things. This is a pop-up book we put together featuring our collections called Amaze. It's an ABC of that, and it does include some natural history material.
I just saw this.
Yeah.
Real.
All right. And so some of them are quite spectacular.
Oh, my God.
And this is for sale. And
Wow.
website, you don't have to buy it. Well, you do, but I'll give you a good price. And is this the latest one? Then, it's the natural history coloring book as well. So if the flight back to Colorado is a bit slow, you can pop in color.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
And
Thank you so much.
here's a card as well.
Thank you so
Anyway,
much.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
for
This
coming.
has been really lovely.
It's
Thank
been a
you.
treasure. Thank you. And thank you for tuning in, and
Yes,
thank you
thank
for
you.
coming here.
Everybody online.